to help, so we may have to flip back and forth here. So Mrs. Gonzo, we know she is flying 205 feet above sea level. So we could put her 205 feet. And then the birds are going to fly 50 feet below Mrs. Gonzo. So there's a little bit of work to do with those. So she was, what did we say, 205. So we'll call her up here. She is at 205 feet. And that's Mrs. Gonzo. And she is in an airplane. So there she is flying up above. And then we said the birds were 50 feet below her. So the birds are still above sea level, but we have to put them, we have to know that their distance from the 205 to come down, their distance has to be 50 feet between this point and this point. So we have to figure out what are our birds at. Well, there's a little bit of math involved to get that. And in order to figure that out, you would have to take the absolute value of 205, which is really just 205, and subtract 50 from that. 205 minus 50, and so that's 155. So the birds would be at 155 feet. They're still above sea level, so they're positive. Both of these numbers are positive. They're just 50 feet between where she's at and where the birds are at. So there's 50 feet difference. But they're also 155 from that to 0. The next clue in our story talks about the whale that's swimming 320 feet below sea level. So below means we're going to be in the negatives. So 300, so we'll put the whale down here, and we'll call this negative 320 feet, and that is the whale. Oops, I forgot to put my birds up here. So the whale negative tells you that it's because it said it below sea level, so it's negative, so that's down there. And then Mrs. Bramble is swimming 200 feet above the whale. So 200 feet above the whale is Mrs. Bramble. Now, am I still below sea level? Well, it would take 320 to get back to 0. It says I'm only 200 feet above that. So I've got to go from here, and I've got to go up 200 feet is the distance between here and here. So I'm still below sea level. So if I put me in here, I'm still at a negative number. I just need to figure out what that negative number is. It's 200 above 320. So the math that goes involved here is the absolute value of negative 320, which is really just 320. And you still have to subtract 200 to figure out that I would be swimming 120 feet below sea level. So I'm below sea level, which means my number's a negative 120. Sorry, so you can see that. The reason why I take the absolute value is I'm just looking at this distance compared to this distance, so I don't need the negative. The negative just tells me I'm plotting it below 0 here. But when I'm looking at distances between them, I'm taking their absolute value. So then I'm at negative 120 feet, and that's Mrs. Bramble swimming. And then the last clue said that Mrs. Toffelmeyer, Mrs. T, is floating on the water at sea level. So what does on the water at sea level mean for that clue? She would be at 0. So she's kind of here in the boat. And so Mrs. T, she would be at 0 feet. It's not a positive or a negative. She is at sea level, so she is 0 feet. So we kind of drew this picture to help us. You're going to have one like this on your homework, so you need to be able to draw these pictures here to help you out. So here are the questions that you have to answer. Question A says, what is the vertical distance between Mrs. G and Mrs. B, question mark. What's the distance between basically Mrs. Gonzalez and Mrs. Bramwell? So you're trying to figure out how do you figure out their differences. So like one's above sea level and one's below. So if you use their absolute values and you use the 205 and you use the 120, when one's above and one's below, you can almost add these two together to see, because it's going to take 120 just for me to get back to 0, and then from 0 you got to go an additional 205 to get to Mrs. Gonzalez. So she's 205 from 0 and I'm 120 from 0, and we're on different sides. So you're actually taking the absolute value, so let me change colors here, absolute value of 205, and you're adding it to the absolute value of the negative 120. So what does that mean? That's really just saying 205 plus 120, and the difference between us is 325 feet, which makes sense because I'm below and she's above, so we kind of have to add those together to get our distances. So you're always taking absolute value of distances. Why do we add? Well, she was above and I was below, so we had to add them. When they were on the same side, we subtracted them to figure out their differences between each other. So that kind of helps you out. How far below sea level is Mrs. Bramwell? I think we kind of already answered that. How far below sea level is Mrs. B? And we drew that I had to be 200 above the whale, so when we did that subtracting, because we were both on the same side of 0, we're both kind of in the negatives, so you subtract their differences. I was at 120 feet below sea level. So you either have to write 120 feet below sea level, or you have to write negative 120 feet, because the negative tells you that I'm below, or the word below tells you that I'm below. So it's one or the other that you have to write when comparing my distance. Part C, how far above Mrs. B are the birds? Question mark. How far above Mrs. B are the birds? So if you look at our picture, I'm below sea level and the birds are above, so it's similar to the one where I was below and Mrs. Gonzo was above. You had to take Gonzo's distance and then you had to add it to my distance. Well, now you still have to add the bird's distance from 0 and my distance from 0. Since we're on two different sides of 0, you kind of add them both together, like this plus this would be the total distance between us. So your mathematical statement would be the absolute value of negative 120, and you would have to add it to the absolute value of 155. Those are the distances of Mrs. B, which is actually just a positive 120 plus a 155, and the distance between us is 275 feet. Part D, which is closer to sea level? Question mark. Mrs. B or the birds? And then it says by how much? So if you look at your picture, who's closer to sea level? The birds are 155 away and I'm 120 away. So who's closer? Mrs. B. So then by how much? Mrs. B is closer by how much? How do you figure out like why am I closer by how much am I closer by? Well, if you think about it, Mrs. B was at negative 120 and the birds were at a positive 155. So we're like comparing them to 0, like on a number line. If I were comparing these 155s here, negative 120s here, and 0 somewhere there, I'm trying to figure out on a number line here by how much. Well, this is 120 away, this is 155 away. So you're almost trying to figure out the difference of this one's 120 away and this is 155 away. So taking their absolute values, you can subtract them to find their difference. So 155 minus 120 I am 35 feet closer to sea level than they are. I just happen to be below sea level and they're above sea level. But I'm still 35 feet closer to zero than they are. So the homework that goes with this is a extra practice worksheet, 2.2, numbers 1 through 18 all. And on number 18, you need to draw a picture to help answer the questions, just like we did here in our notes.